Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, leftist progressive sports fans and social radicals, and welcome to another edition of Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and in any of the over 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio member network. If you can't listen live or happen to miss any of today's show, you can get access by subscribing to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or the Google Play Store. Editions of our broadcast are also available at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, thoughts about program coverage, or ideas for future shows and updates at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or the contact page at NASRadicalSports.com. You may have noticed over the month of February that we were off the air. The flu and some other health issues came up that made it really incredibly difficult to start recording, with coughing up a lung just about, my voice going out, and every week something new for the month of February pretty much coming up. And so it ended up being a involuntary hiatus during the month of February, and we missed a ton of sports and politics stories that came out during that month, and it really pained me to not have the ability to come on and start talking about those issues. But we are back. We are off the disabled list, and we are ready to go talking about the recent sports and politics stories that have been coming out, and we've got a whole lot to talk to you about this week on our episode. First of all, some jeers to the 4 nameless Chicago hockey fans who decided that it was going to be somehow a smart idea to start chanting basketball at Devontae Smith-Pelly during last Saturday's game, and were ultimately banned from the stadium for their overtly dumb and racist behavior. We also want to send some jeers to the wrestling coach at Wilmington High School, Kelly Tolliver, who allegedly outed one of the wrestlers on his team as being trans and then forced that wrestler to change in the girls' locker room. But we do want to send some props and some big solidarity out to Mac Beggs. The Texas wrestler won his second high school wrestling title, and it is very, very awesome to see a prominent trans athlete using his platform to speak out about trans issues and also winning a second high school wrestling title. Again, further proof that being political does not necessarily mean not being focused on your sport. And I think the fact that the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl again shows that being political does not mean you're not focused on your sport and can't reach the highest echelons. So hopefully we can smash that idea that being an activist athlete means that you're somehow not focused on your job or not somehow focused on winning a championship or winning a title. Hopefully that idea can go to the dustbin of history where it absolutely belongs. Well, we've got basketball news, we've got hockey news, we have got Olympics news to talk about, some baseball news, and we're going to get right into it this week talking the NBA. In NBA news this week, LeBron James said recently that President Trump, quote, doesn't give an expletive, well, he used the actual word that we can't say on the air, he doesn't give an expletive about the people, close quote, during an interview. Well, the Fox News host Laura Ingraham took to her show and said that LeBron's statements were ungrammatical and unintelligible, and followed up by telling LeBron James to, quote, shut up and dribble, close quote. LeBron posted a sign saying, quote, I am more than an athlete, we will not shut up and dribble, and then stated, the best thing she did was help me create more awareness. Now, when she starts talking about things that are ungrammatical and unintelligible, I take it she hasn't read many stories and tweets and public statements coming from the Make America Great Again crowd. People in glass houses really shouldn't throw stones about being ungrammatical and unintelligible about issues. And Deadspin did a hilarious clapback where they took a series of Fox News stories where they had a number of athletes on to promote stuff and talk about political issues, and showed all of these different athletes coming on to talk about conservative right-wing political issues and conservative right-wing political issues, or to push a relatively non-controversial agenda. That we had to see all of these different athletes on to talk about conservative political issues, and not a single time were they told to shut up and dribble or shut up and go back in your lane as being an athlete. That never did that come up. And of course, this is kind of amusing. It's a great clapback that, nobody wants to hear athletes be political and that they should keep their opinions to themselves because their own station decides that they're instead going to allow these athletes to come on and start making these sorts of statements. But it's funny, but it highlights the streak in American discourse, which has been going on for decades and decades and decades and generations, where we do not want to hear from people, especially people of color, if it's any way disruptive to our daily lives. If it any way causes a problem for me and how I live my immediate life, we don't want to hear about it. That it becomes too much of a downer or too much of an issue, and that everybody just needs to come together and stop being divisive, which completely ignores the reality of why they're complaining. It harkens back to Malcolm X in the 1960s talking about you can't stab somebody in the back 9 inches, pull the knife out 6 inches, say that's progress. That we can't just immediately have everybody come together in this kumbaya movement of not being divided anymore without recognizing and dealing with substantively the very real issues of institutionalized racism, institutionalized sexism, institutionalized transphobia, institutionalized homophobia. We can't necessarily go and deal with any of these issues until we've addressed these institutional problems and really addressed the reason why they're speaking out. But the idea about black athletes being there for our entertainment and not getting to be full people is something that we've experienced for a very, very long time. Even non-athlete people of color. The idea that they should just be seen and not heard, and largely just accept the system that they're living in, is something that we've known for years, whether it's back in the earliest eras of the civil rights movement and the pushback there, people telling them to stop. Or in the 1960s, the fact that when Martin Luther King died, he was, in a public opinion poll, thoroughly disliked because he continued bringing up these issues and continued to highlight these issues of intersectionality. This is a narrative of white people telling people of color to sit down, to be quiet, and don't upset a system that so very casually has its boot right on your neck. And that's the problem here. Laura Ingraham wants shut up and dribble. Shut up and dribble. And the mantra of shut up and dribble is incredibly problematic. It's incredibly challenging to deal with. That athletes don't get to be human beings, that athletes don't get to necessarily come out and live their lives and speak out about the world in which they live and the impacts that racism, sexism, homophobia, and other issues have on them. That it's supposed to just be shut up and dribble and let her, be the news anchor that comes out and gets to have her public statements be put out and her opinions okay to be put out and okay to be put out there publicly. But another person who has a prominent celebrity status is not allowed to do that. And it leads me into one of these weird, rare moments where I have to say a sentence I never thought I'd really say all that often. But it's, I agree with Stephen A. Smith. Stephen A. Smith was on Will Cain's radio show and said, quote, "People from different ethnic backgrounds may take it differently. She has an obligation to be sensitive to that because if they hear it differently than you or I heard it, she holds some culpability in that regard. It is my belief that, and those emanating from a plethora in the African-American community, that white folks come to work every day with a job to do. We come with a responsibility. I'm on the airwaves. You have the license, Will Cain, to sit up there and say, I'm going to tell you how I feel. I don't speak for us. I don't speak for white folks. But I'm telling you right now, it's a sports-related item in this instance. It could be anything else, and the black community is like, make sure you say this, make sure you say that. You've got to address this. If you take into account history, the kind of things we've been subjected to, the kinds of challenges we are forced to have to overcome every single day of our lives, there is this belief emanating from our community that you have to recognize those challenges, be sensitive to it, and keep that thought process in your mind. You have to be cognizant to that. That is not something a white individual has to be concerned about. Will Kane can come on national TV and speak for Will Kane, and the white community is not going to hold you accountable for what you do or don't feel. But as a black person, if you don't sit up there and at least echo, not saying you're obligated to agree, but if you don't at least echo that sentiment, then the belief is that you don't relate to history and what history has taught us. There's a comfort level in these United States of America that you have enjoyed that most black Americans will tell you they never have and they never will enjoy. We have to live with what we have to live with. There's a reason why LeBron James, who's worth close to $1 billion and has a house in Brentwood, gets the N-word spray painted on his gate in that house in Brentwood. There's a reason for that. It's constantly reminding us that no matter how far we climb, there's always something or someone or a plethora of people or a particular group in the populace who believes or who's quick to remind us that we are just what we are. And the emboldened white supremacist behavior, the emboldened neo-Nazi behavior, is becoming relatively a new normal in this current nadir of politics that we're in. And recognizing the fact that there is the very extensive history of racialized state use of violence and even extrajudicial use of violence, that we have this very real issue of violence, that white supremacist behavior has become more emboldened recently, but it's also been emboldened, very popular throughout eras of history, that this is a new nadir that we're in. And we really shouldn't be surprised that this sort of commentary is, coming out from Laura Ingraham, talking about how black athletes need to shut up and dribble and basically just put their head down and do whatever it is that they're told to do and go out there and just be our entertainment. It really is not that surprising because it's become so normalized and so accepted within the wider political sphere that every time we talk about something that is just overtly, completely racist, everything gets called racial or racialized or all of these other weasel words that we don't want to use when we can't just call it what it is, which is racist. And to tell a black athlete to shut up and dribble when they're speaking out, when you didn't necessarily say that to white athletes who have been speaking out on issues. You didn't necessarily say that to a number of other athletes who have been speaking out. But now that we have quite possibly one of the best basketball players ever speaking out, Laura Ingraham and the MAGA crowd comes out and starts yelling about how he needs to shut up and dribble and just, basically know his place. And that is an incredibly problematic sphere, but it's also connected to these decades and decades and decades long policy of racialized politics in America and the push to make sure that athletes aren't speaking out, that athletes aren't saying something, especially athletes of color and even citizens of color throughout American history. Meanwhile, in other basketball news, the Dallas Mavericks are back in the news, and trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual harassment and sexual abuse. The former team president and CEO, Turdema Useri, was called out in Sports Illustrated as an alleged serial sexual harasser. His name was put out there to be a potential NBA commissioner when Commissioner Stern left the job. He got a lot of positive press. He got a lot of positive attention and a lot of people talking about how great Turdema Useri was. As Sports Illustrated described it, quote, interviews with more than a dozen former and current Mavericks employees in different departments conducted during a months-long Sports Illustrated investigation paint a picture of a corporate culture rife with misogyny and predatory sexual behavior, alleged public fondling by the team president, outright domestic assault by a high-profile member of the Mavs.com staff, unsupportive or even intimidating responses from superiors who heard complaints of inappropriate behavior from their employees, even an employee who openly watched pornography at his desk. Most sources did not want their names used for a variety of reasons, including fear of retaliation and ostracization, and limits imposed by agreements they signed with the team, close quote. Many former employees noted that they didn't feel entirely comfortable coming forward to HR because the head of the department was a fairly conservative religious guy and was constantly talking to them about, are you sure you didn't do anything to lead this on? Are you sure that you didn't do anything to cause this? And starting to victim blame during the decisions of employees coming forward to HR. One worker alleges that they were threatened with being fired if they complained about the CEO's behavior or if they happened to speak out publicly about the CEO's behavior. They were threatened with firing. Another worker alleges that the beat writer had two domestic violence arrests. One of them a fellow employee, but stayed on the job. And then he was fired only after this Sports Illustrated story came out. He was fired, along with the head of HR who got fired after this story came out. Mark Cuban, the owner of the team and notorious for being a very, very, very hands-on owner, said that he deferred to the CEO and HR and kept being told that nothing bad was happening. He said, quote, "I mean, this is obviously there's a problem in the Mavericks organization and we've got to fix it. That's it. And we're going to take every step. It's not something we tolerate. I don't want it. It's not something that's acceptable. I'm embarrassed, to be honest with you, that it happened under my ownership and it needs to be fixed. Period. End of story." The Mavericks team also hired Evan Krutoy and Ann Milgram to investigate its outside parties. Krutoy was a prosecutor for the Manhattan District Attorney Office for over 20 years and served as acting deputy bureau chief of the Sex Crimes Unit. Milgram's a professor at New York University School of Law and a former attorney general from the state of New Jersey. It's very odd to me to hear Mark Cuban come out and say that he had no idea that this was happening, given how micromanaging of a fashion he has in running this team, given his very real notoriety for being a hands-on micromanaging owner when it comes to so many areas of this. It was really shocking to me to start seeing Mark Cuban come out and say that he had no idea, that on this issue he was delegating to the CEO and he was delegating to human resources and not doing any kind of real investigation into that. I mean, that's certainly potentially true, but it makes me wonder, how could a guy who is so hands-on, so known for being hands-on and micromanaging, not necessarily do that in this particular sphere? And bringing in these people who are involved in the Attorney General's and the District Attorney's Office, it's certainly an interesting idea to keep looking at these issues, but it would also be interesting to bring in activists who are very in touch with the issues of workplace harassment and workplace sexual violence, to bring in people who are experts in that field, not necessarily just the criminality aspects of this, of bringing in somebody who is just part of the carceral system. Because as we all know, people can be found criminally guilty of something and not actually have done it. We also know that a number of people might be found criminally not guilty, and that doesn't mean they didn't do anything. That doesn't mean they didn't do anything. The NBA announced after this investigation that they will be creating a confidential hotline for all teams to talk about inappropriate conduct. The fact that that wasn't a thing that already existed is kind of shocking to me. Not terribly surprising, but kind of shocking that that kind of confidential hotline to start talking about these allegations of inappropriate conduct hasn't already existed. So again, this is incredibly problematic, and I doubt this is the only team that necessarily has these sorts of issues, that it goes beyond the HR guy, or it goes beyond just the CEO, or it goes just beyond the writer for the Mavs.com staff. That this is an institutional issue of refusing to start putting these guys out to pasture when it comes forward that, you know, they have multiple domestic violence complaints, and the only reason they're fired is because the statement comes out publicly and shows that they've been engaged in this kind of behavior. That the investigation is certainly a good start, but I would like to see more people who are on the ground looking at this issue holistically, more on the ground activists also getting involved in this, people who are experts in the fields that aren't necessarily part of a criminal justice system or a carceral system, also being able to be involved in these investigations and helping to come up with recommendations to rework the culture of the front office of the Dallas Mavericks. Well, we are going to jump from the hardwood over to baseball news. Long-time listeners of Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, will remember the Miami Marlins and their owner, Jeffrey Loria, having a really terrible, horrible, no good, very bad deal with Miami-Dade County and the city of Miami that got a huge fleecing of the county and the city to help this billionaire owner build his brand new stadium. Well, Miami-Dade now is suing former owner Jeffrey Loria and the new ownership group that bought the team, saying that the 2009 agreement for the new stadium requires them to get a share of the profits for any sale of the team. Loria refused to pay any money, and the Associated Press says that the franchise failed to provide a detailed calculation from independent accountants as contractually obligated, leaving the county unable to determine whether the Marlins improperly inflated deductions and expenses they claimed they owed to the county and city nothing. Of a $1.2 billion sale, Loria says he lost $140 million on paper. Longtime listeners of this show will also remember that when he wanted this stadium, Loria cried very, very poor. Loria cried poverty. And that's why he was able to get the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County to give him tons and tons and tons and tons of money for this stadium. However, leaked documents of financial records show that he was actually on paper having a loss, but in reality having a profit. And I wonder if that is the case here, that on paper it looks like a loss, but in actuality and in reality, if we look at things, that it is a very real profit if we do look at it in reality and not just what's on the paper. That Jeffrey Loria likely owes the county of Miami-Dade and the city of Miami a lot of money for that boondoggle of a stadium deal that he was able to put forward in the late 2000s. The Major League Baseball Players Association has filed a grievance against the Tampa Bay Rays, the Pittsburgh Pirates, the Oakland Athletics, and the aforementioned Miami Marlins for not spending revenue sharing money in the way that the bargaining agreement expects them to. This season, we've seen a number of free agents not getting signed and a very, very depressed labor market. And we're getting into spring training. We're getting very close in next few weeks to the start of the season, and we have a number of free agents not being signed and a very depressed labor market with not a whole lot of money being spent by owners on a lot of free agent labor going into this. And it's very much a different environment than we've seen before with Major League Baseball, that a number of free agents aren't getting signed and a number of teams not necessarily spending very much money. And teams like the Pirates, the Athletics, the Rays, and the Marlins, if they are doing what they're alleged to have done, not spending the revenue sharing money in the way that they're expected to, it's unsurprising, it's problematic, but it's really not that surprising that they would be engaged in that kind of behavior. And it's something we're going to be keeping an eye out on as we continue the weeks of the baseball season. And Mariners pitcher Rob Whalen spoke out this week about issues of mental health in an interview with MajorLeagueBaseball.com. Talking about the issues of mental health, depression, and the possibility of needing to receive mental health care, he said, quote, "We need to change the stigma that you're fragile if you talk about it, because that's not the case. We need to continue the conversation. It's almost like when you're an alcoholic, you have to admit you're an alcoholic. For me, it was, okay, let me say those words out loud of how I've been feeling inside for so long. Feeling if I did say it, people would think I'm crazy. I was 23, I'd gotten into the big leagues, and I had a great life. There wasn't a lot to be upset about, but I was just miserable. So it was hard to understand it myself, let alone explain it to others." And throughout the interview, he talks about how he started suffering from these issues as a teenager and that he only started to talk about it while he was in the minor league. So he went from as a teen into his high school, like throughout his high school career, pitching in college, pitching in the minors, and he only just started talking about it while he was in the minors to try to handle it. And then even then, while being a major league athlete, coming out and starting to talk about it, that it was hard for him to understand himself and speak out. And he said that he was prompted to speak out after the suicide of Washington State football player Tyler Helinski, that removing the stigma to talk about mental health issues and the idea that you're fragile if you talk about it. Because very often in sports, and really even outside of sports, we look at somebody who has, a broken ankle or a torn ACL or a torn pectoral, and they have to be out games. And we look at that fact that, they need the surgery, they need the medical care for that, and that they're going to be rehabbing it and they're going to be working back to try to get back into the games eventually. And recognizing that they do need the time off, they do need the time to see the medical care. When it comes to a mental health case, whether it's anxiety, depression, manic depression, bipolar disorder, we don't necessarily see that because it's not as visible as somebody going in and having surgery to repair an ACL or somebody having a cast on a limb. And that becomes part of the issue of, well, they can play, they're just, faking it. Well, have they tried not being sad? All these other really trite euphemisms that people throw out there. So big props to pitcher Rob Whalen of the Seattle Mariners for taking the time to speak out about that very important issue of mental health. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, nasradicalsports.com. We've just been talking about Fox News demanding athletes stop talking about politics. Well, they continue to talk about politics. The horrid handling of institutional harassment by the Dallas Mavericks, and some props to Rob Whalen using his platform to talk about mental health and trying to smash the stigma surrounding it. Coming up, we'll be talking about politicians trying to keep athletes from protesting and the latest in the NCAA's quote-unquote scandal of players being compensated. In unpaid college sports news, remember when Donald Trump got all mad at LeVar Ball for not being sufficiently thankful to him for getting his son LiAngelo out of jail, and then said that he should have let LiAngelo Ball stay in jail in China over allegations of shoplifting? Remember when Donald Trump said that he was the only one who did anything to get LiAngelo Ball out of jail, and LeVar then said Trump didn't really do anything and didn't need to be thanked? Well, a new report from ESPN proves Donald Trump lied and LeVar Ball was pretty much right. A source in the report says, quote, "The players were already checked into the hotel before the public discovered they were arrested. They were not under house arrest. It was our decision to keep them at the hotel until the situation was resolved. The charges were dropped, they weren't reduced, and that happened 2 days before we heard from General Kelly," close quote. That Donald Trump and General Kelly really didn't do anything, but then came out and started asking to be thanked, and that their thanks were not sufficiently thankful, and that he should have let him stay in jail. Like, this is totally just the narrative of Trump saying random things. Saying just random things that he knows not to be true, but then says, believe me, and anything else that goes against it is fake news. But it fits this narrative of Trump lying and wanting people of color to be over the top, to just simply bow in deference to whatever it is that he's pushing or he's saying, or the agenda of his support base is pushing and he is saying. We go back to Laura Ingraham at the top of the show telling LeBron to shut up and dribble, that LiAngelo and LeVar need to be sufficiently publicly thankful to Donald Trump, and pushing that kind of narrative of respectability politics, that we see this happening over and over again. It's not isolated instance just President Trump or just Laura Ingraham, that this is happening over and over again as we're fitting into this new nadir of a political era. That we've got another instance where the president has been shown at best to have not told us the truth, and at worst to have overtly lied to us. And LeVar Ball, for all the logical criticisms you can have of him for his misogyny and his other issues, was absolutely right when he said that Donald Trump didn't do anything worthy of being thanked, because it really just seems that it was UCLA that did it and not anything that the president or the president's helpers did. Meanwhile, at the University of Delaware, Bonnie Kenny and Cindy Gregory alleged that they were fired for their sexual orientation because they are both lesbian volleyball coaches, and the courts have ruled this week that the case can go forward as they showed a prima facie case that they were indeed discriminated on sexual orientation, their marital status, and age discrimination. We'll, of course, be keeping an eye out on this case as it moves forward and bring up more to you as that case continues. Meanwhile, the University of Wisconsin and their women's basketball team is in the news thanks to Iowa Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, who is all mad at Marcia Howard, one of the players for the University of Wisconsin's women's basketball team. At last Sunday's game against Iowa, there was no tunnel near the bench, and Howard has decided that during the anthem, she is going to remain in the tunnel to protest gun violence. The Iowa Stadium has no tunnel near the bench, so she couldn't do what she had been doing pretty much all season. So she sat on the bench during the anthem. Oh, I know everybody start, clutching your pearls. I probably should have told you to sit down before I said that she took a knee during the anthem. Well, constituents all wrote to Senator Grassley that they were mad and they were offended and this was problematic. I'm sure we could co-opt the right wing's language about a bunch of triggered snowflakes getting mad about a person of color sitting down during a song they like. Well, Senator Grassley then directed people to express their outrage to the university and the head coach of Wisconsin's basketball team. The head coach of Wisconsin's basketball team said, quote, "I'm proud of Marcia to be able to express her opinion and will continue to support our players." This week, Senator Grassley doubled down and said that he was talking about killings in Chicago and noted, "We don't talk about that." That we don't talk about the killings in Chicago and the violence in Chicago. And really, anybody on the left end of the spectrum, especially towards the more radical end of the left end of the spectrum, knows that this is racially coded language. When we're talking about killings in Chicago, we're talking about black people getting killed and black people killing black people, and we don't want to talk about that. And the real savage issue in this is not only is that racially coded language to stop talking about the issue of police killings of unarmed people, it diverts that attention because they can't defend the fact that police are killing unarmed people at such record rates and then not being charged for it or not ever being criminally held accountable for it, because that's indefensible. So they move it to, well, what about black people killing black people in Chicago? Well, the issue is here that Howard is from Chicago, and that's part of her protest. The protest that Senator Grassley and his snowflake constituents are trying to stop. Maybe we take a line out of Laura Ingram's idea and tell Senator Grassley to shut up and legislate. Actually change these issues if he's really so concerned about them. Actually change these issues and recognize that somebody has a First Amendment right to sit during a song that you may like. Maybe you focus on that. Maybe you look at that idea, that you have the First Amendment right, but then you're not being sufficiently patriotic enough. Well, we live in a country where you don't have to have these kind of litmus tests of patriotism. That you don't have to have these litmus tests of patriotism. That going back to the 1940s, that we had the West Virginia State Board of Education case versus Barnett. And in this case, a group of students was sitting during the flag salute. And during the seating of their flag salute, because of their religious issues, they went and got in trouble with the school. And in that case, the Supreme Court said that the flag salute was a form of speech and that the state can't compel those forms of speech. But Senator Grassley is attempting to use his state political office in which to do just that. In fact, paraphrasing one of the statements from the justices who wrote the opinion on that, saying if there's anything in the constitutional constellation, it's that no person, no official gets to, petty or high, gets to describe what's going to be orthodox in the fields of politics. And how quickly we forget that, how quickly we forget that idea while starting to talk about all these issues of patriotism and loving our country. It's loving a certain political vein of our country and reactionary politics and reactionary ideas. And because they can't defend the issue of state violence against people, they go forward with this, well, they don't really care about black-on-black violence, and start deflecting to a number of other issues. and some fantastic work by Lindsay Gibbs over at Think Progress, as well as the Burn It All Down feminist podcast on sports. Lindsay Gibbs interviewed Marcia Howard, and Marcia Howard had this to say about Senator Grassley, quote, "It was his opinion, but I refuse to back down from what I believe in. I don't understand how exercising my constitutional right isn't being patriotic. The First Amendment allows me to petition the government and to peacefully assemble. Facts prove the systemic oppression and the fight to keep people of color in the back with their mouths shut. It's not shut up and dribble when we're out there doing for our community. Whatever we stand up or speak on topics that relate to us about racial disparities, it's always shut up and dribble." And that's absolutely true, and it's what we mentioned at the start of the show as well, that whenever athletes or any person of color starts to speak up, it's shut up and get back in line, shut up and dribble, be sufficiently thankful to me even though I didn't necessarily do anything to actually help. That it's very much trying to keep a very real political line of very limited political involvement, very limited ideas of what's politically acceptable. And we see this even in the cases of the NCAA and the payment of athletes, that the overwhelmingly amount of black athletes who are providing the funds to fund a number of non-revenue producing sports, that the labor of black athletes is providing for the opportunities for a number of white athletes to engage in their boutique sports and their non-revenue producing sports, that we have the labor of black bodies profiting other whites, as well as these schools, the athletic directors, and all of the myriad people in all of the corporations that are sponsoring all of the major conferences and those heads, the TV networks, that we have all of these people profiting off of the labor of overwhelmingly amounts of black bodies. And so a number of players have been trying to gain their status as employees to be paid. Well, in response to a case of Lawrence Livers arguing that his scholarship and other scholarship athletes deserve to be paid as employees, the NCAA has used the case Van Skyke versus Peters. Why would they use this case to try to justify that they shouldn't have to pay players? I still can't figure that one out, because they've used this case twice before and won. Van Skyke versus Peters is a case from the 1990s in the state of Illinois, where Van Skyke was a prisoner at Illinois' Stateville prison, and he sued to be paid for work that was done at the prison, and he sued the director of the Department of Corrections, Howard Peters. The court cited the 13th Amendment to not allow Van Skyke to be paid, because the way that the 13th Amendment is worded says that slavery is abolished in the United States except as a punishment for a crime. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. That exemption about except as a punishment for a crime is the part that doomed the Van Skyke case. How in the hell are prisoners the same as college athletes? How the hell are prisoners the same as college athletes? And now it can be said that the NCAA, in their own court filings, is trying to use the 13th Amendment's exception for slave labor to make okay their exploitative processes. They're legitimately trying to use the exceptions in the 13th Amendment that allow for slave labor to help justify their exploitative processes. Certainly, it's one thing to say that the NCAA is slavery, but when they themselves are using the exceptions that are justified for slave labor, then certainly that case can be made, because it's not me here sitting, in a radio studio as a lefty making that argument. It's the NCAA in their own actual court filings arguing this. And this is all coming up and coming to a head because the FBI is investigating a number of different schools involved with basketball recruiting, and they found out, I know we may want to sit down for this because you might get shocked, some of the athletes get paid when they're not supposed to be paid for their labor. I know, we're all shocked, we're all concerned, right, that some of the athletes actually got paid for the labor and for the work that they're doing, that some of the athletes actually got money and got compensated. And a number of different schools have been alleged to have been involved in this. Most notably is Arizona with their basketball coach Sean Miller caught on an FBI wiretap talking to an agent trying to negotiate a $100,000 payment to get a recruit to the school. And it is a recruit that ultimately went to Arizona. The school's contract is written in such a way that Sean Miller is paid $10.3 million if he is fired for cause. So if they fire him for being on a wiretap negotiating this $100,000 payment, Sean Miller gets paid double what he'd normally get paid. If he is fired for a legitimate cause, he gets paid more because of the way that this contract is written. And when you look at all the amounts of money that are there for all the adults in this system, and then they're trying to cry poor when it comes to the issues involved with paying the athletes. There's plenty of money to go around. There is plenty of money to go around in this system. Everybody that's an adult is getting paid. Why not pay the athletes? Everybody is getting paid that's an adult off of the labor of these guys. Everyone, every single one of these people is getting paid off the work of these athletes. And not a single dime is going to the players. And certainly you can say that a scholarship is a form of payment, but when you're asked to play more games, well, then that's a pay cut. Or the fact that we have graduate employees at countries across the school, schools across the nation, where they get tuition waivers and they also get a stipend payment that their tuition is covered and they get paid for the labor that they produce. Stan Van Gundy, the Detroit Pistons coach, was asked about the NCAA and this recent case of a number of schools being wrapped up in the possibility that they might have paid players to come to the school or paid players for their performance. He said, quote, "The NCAA is one of the worst organizations, maybe the worst organization in sports. They certainly don't care about the athlete. They're going to act like they're appalled by all these things going on in college basketball. Please, it's ridiculous, and it's all coming down on the coaches. The people that were against players coming out of high school made a lot of excuses, but I think a lot of it was racist. I've never heard anybody go up in arms about minor league baseball or hockey. They're not making big money, and they're white kids primarily, and nobody has a problem. But all of a sudden you got a black kid that wants to come out of high school and make millions. That's a bad decision by bypassing college to go play for $800 a month in minor league baseball. That's a fine decision. What the hell's going on? You can turn 18 and you can go work anywhere else. An 18-year-old, if they're talented enough, can come into your profession and get a job. I think personally, and now that I'm definitely on a soapbox, but the people against them coming out made a lot of excuses, but I think a lot of it was racist, quite honestly." Close quote. And certainly the one-and-done rule is also part of the NBA, that the NCAA can't totally fix it just by themselves. And largely that was a way to keep veteran players as well getting jobs in the league and not being taken over by 18-year-old freshmen coming into the league as rookies. And he's absolutely right. The NCAA is one of the worst organizations and quite possibly one of the worst organizations in sports because they don't care about the athletes. They don't care about the athletes. They care that the athletes are getting paid. You can look at the way that they've had abject silence on Michigan State, that up until the point where it hit critical mass about Penn State, they were absolutely silent there too. But anytime any player gets close to any kind of money, they're there and, we'll be right there, and they're already investigating and pushing forward on it. LeBron said, quote, "I don't know if there's any fixing the NCAA. I don't think there is. It's what's been going on for many, 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 many years. I don't know how you can fix it. I don't see how you can fix it. Me and my mom was poor, I'll tell you that, and they expected me to step foot on a college campus and not go to the NBA. We weren't going to be poor for long, I'll tell you that. That's a fact. Obviously, I've never been a part of it, so I don't know all the ins and outs about it. I do know what five-star athletes bring to a campus, both in basketball and football. I know how much these college coaches get paid. I know how much these colleges are gaining off these kids. I've always heard the narrative that they get a free education, but you guys are not bringing me on campus to get an education. You guys are bringing me on it to help you get to a Final Four or to a national championship. So it's just a weird thing." Jalen Rose, the former college player, was also asked, and he said, quote, "There were so many people who were on television, on media, who had the attitude in the early 90s, just shut up and be happy that you're getting a scholarship. I wish somebody was paying for my education. Who are you to ask for more?" But that's not what being Americans all truly about. And for me, the collegiate system is always what represented I call indentured servitude. The colleges and universities and coaches, they've all been bought and sold, and now it's time for the players to actually participate in this revenue stream. ESPN and former college athlete Jay Williams said that gross revenue in college sports and the scholarships have been staying the same. And he broached the topic of the fact that when gross revenues in other industries go up, the amount of compensation to the employees goes up. And he broached the topic of athletes boycotting the Final Four as a potential method to make change and start making demands on the institutions of the NCAA and the institutions of these member schools to start getting paid for their labor. And Lonzo Ball said, quote, "Everybody knows everybody's getting paid. That's just how it is. Everybody's getting paid anyway. You might as well make it legal. That's how I feel." And Lonzo Ball is absolutely correct. Everybody's pretty much already getting paid, and they are being compensated for their labor. Oh no, players getting compensated for the labor that they create. And that the NCAA is going to come in here and be mad about it and force a Michigan State athlete to pay $40 to a charity to be reinstated shows just how skewed their priorities are when they haven't really mentioned a mumbling word about the Larry Nassar scandal at Michigan State. But they're there to make sure that a basketball player donates his $40 to be eligible again. It shows you where the messed up priorities are of the NCAA and why it's incredibly problematic that we still have this indentured servitude system set up to exploit people. And it relies on the 13th Amendment's exception for slave labor in part to get it done. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, NassRadicalSports.com, a radical look at sports. We've just been talking about the quote-unquote scandal of NCAA athletes being compensated from their labor, when the real scandal should be the huge system of exploitation that is D1 college basketball and football. Coming up, we'll be looking at the Olympics, the U.S. trying to clean house of officials who oversaw mass institutional abuse, and Allie Raceman's lawsuit alleging that the U.S. Olympic Committee did not protect athletes. And we are going to close out this in our final segment with other sports news. In other sports news this week, in the Olympics that just recently closed in Pyeongchang, Lindsey Vonn did not medal in part of the games, and so a bunch of triggered MAGA goofs got all mad, and they went and started trolling, and they got triggered because she said something about the president, and she had a whole lot of class in dealing with them. She had a whole lot of class in addressing these guys who just started trolling her and trolling her and trolling her and trolling her because she dared to say something about the world in which she lived. A number of ski shops in South Korea have complained that rentals are down 80% and over 50 of the stores have closed, and they started to put up banners saying they want to, quote, keep our right to live, and that, quote, 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics kill us. There was also an entire village, the village of Sukhan, which was destroyed to build parking lots, a luxury resort, and a helicopter pad for the ski slopes at Mount Garawang. As well as many of the people got displaced, they had to move into much smaller homes than they previously had before. That a number of the people did not get a home of similar size or basically looking the exact same, that they were put into much smaller public housing. And we also saw 58,000 trees from an ancient forest being taken down, which is not only the environmental aspect of losing 58,000 trees, but also a religious aspect because many of them were considered sacred. So when we start talking about the pageantry and the politics of the Olympics, then great, let's remember that the village of Sukhan was completely destroyed, what effect it's actually having on the ground there. And, of course, when the United Korean team came in, Mike Pence decided to sit down during their anthem. Mike Pence, noted guy who gets mad about people sitting down during anthems, sat down during an anthem. Mike Pence, do you recognize irony? Do you understand what irony is? Because the fact that you decided that you were going to sit down to protest something during a song and use that moment to protest something you didn't like. Can you then explain to me why you got mad about somebody doing that during a song that you liked? Meanwhile, USA Swimming, and trigger warning, we are going to be talking about issues of sexual abuse in the next coming stories. The head of Safe Sports USA Swimming program is out over a conflict of interest of having been connected to a coach who is being investigated for inappropriate sexual contact and having been connected to him at the time of that investigation. The managing director for club development, Pat Hogan, was also fired from USA Swimming. Documents were found by the Orange County Register that found thorough hundreds of cases of swimmers having been sexually abused, and how several top members of USA Swimming seemed to know about the issue and allegedly did not do anything. We also have issues involving the Larry Nassar case. Over 260 women came forward and talked about the abuse that they suffered at the hands of the former Olympic and Michigan State doctor in the guise of medical treatment. Well, now U.S. gymnast Allie Raceman has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Olympic Committee and USA Gymnastics. She alleges that USA's Olympic Committee and USA Gymnastics knew at the highest echelons that Larry Nassar's abuse was occurring and that they failed to protect the gymnasts. She noted that when she first reported, she was allegedly told, quote, to be quiet, close quote. And Raceman then said about this lawsuit, quote, after all this time, they remain unwilling to conduct a full investigation, and without a solid understanding of how this happened, it is delusional to think sufficient changes can be implemented. I refuse to wait any longer for these organizations to do the right thing. It is my hope and that the legal process will hold them accountable and enable the change that is so desperately needed, close quote. We also have the first male gymnast, Jacob Moore, coming forward and alleging that Nassar was abusing him by supposedly treating his shoulder pain with acupuncture near his genitals. And so we have the first male athlete, as well as the over 260 female athletes coming forward talking about Larry Nassar and the sexual abuse and how not really anything was getting done. We also saw Chief Executive of the U.S. Olympic Committee, Scott Blackman, decide to resign. They announced that it was for health reasons, as he is currently fighting prostate cancer. But he has faced horrific criticism for his horrid handling of the Larry Nassar scandal. We now have the USA Swimming scandal that's coming up here, the abuse at the Caroli Ranch in USA Gymnastics, that they're starting to clean house, and I wonder if they think that simply firing these people is going to be enough without any kind of real institutional investigation and putting in real institutional safeguards and institutional changes. Going back to the top of the show with the Dallas Mavericks, I wonder if they think that just removing certain people out is going to change everything when it's really the institutions and the culture that's there that need to have some systemic change, that simply getting rid of certain people might not necessarily just make that sole entire change. In soccer news, FC Cincinnati, the West End neighborhood of Cincinnati, is really quite mad that there's going to be plans to build a new soccer stadium in their neighborhood, especially when the fact that there's nothing wrong with the current stadium that the team plays in. The plan is going to tear down a high school stadium named for a local black activist and then cause that stadium to be built on land that was originally meant for housing. And then that housing is going to be built at, well, someplace they haven't figured out yet. A number of residents all spoke out about the decision to knock down this high school stadium, move this stadium to where housing was going to be built, and then they don't have an idea of where the new housing is going to be built. One of the residents, LaShawn Taylor, spoke up and said, quote, "No one wants y'all here. Please go somewhere else," close quote. And a number of people started applauding and clapping. And that's absolutely right. Go someplace else. Go to the original place where you have your stadium, where you have the public funding. It's already built and it's perfectly working, and there is nothing wrong with it at all. In Qatar, the World Cup is again coming under fire as a British coroner blamed work conditions for the death of Zachary Cox, a worker at one of the stadiums. Zachary Cox fell nearly 40 meters in January 2017 when a faulty hoist he was using got suspended and then broke at the Khalifa International Stadium in Doha, Qatar. He fell head first, suffering massive brain injuries and a broken neck. He survived briefly and then died at the hospital. The coroner said that they, quote, knew or should have known that they were effectively requiring a group of their workers to rely on potentially lethal equipment, close quote, and that they did not really do anything about that. This is what happens when we have these massive sporting events. We see workers being harmed. We see the issues of the communities being harmed, and that the speed of putting these stadiums together and trying to put all of the stadiums together for these mass these mass sporting events leads to a number of instances where we have athletes and in unsafe conditions. We have the workers in unsafe conditions trying to put these together at a ridiculous speed, and that trying to put these up there using whatever they've got and not necessarily even recognizing or necessarily caring that they're relying on potentially lethal equipment, that the speed was just get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done now, get it done now, get it done fast, get it done now. And it's led to the death of yet another worker. That there were estimates that by the time you calculate the deaths of all the workers on the World Cup stadiums for the 2022 games in Qatar, that it will outpace more people than are going to play on all of the teams in the World Cup tournament. And to close out this week's show, we just want to send a big shout out of solidarity to the University of Illinois Graduate Employees Organization, the GEO, in the midst of their strike for a fair contract. Solidarity and best wishes to you on the lines demanding your tuition waivers and facing down with an administration that is doubling down on refusing to negotiate. So this has been Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports. Our show is available for broadcast on college and community radio stations, low-power FM stations, and in any of the 180 stations of the Pacifica Radio Number Network. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's show talking about the Olympics, we talked about NBA news, and a number of athletes speaking out, the NCAA's collegiate court debacle, and the scandal of athletes being compensated for their labor, as well as the reactionary pushbacks of athletes of color speaking out, essentially telling them to, quote, shut up and dribble, and the realities of why that's a problem. Then you can subscribe to our podcast feed on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or through the Google Play Store. Editions of our broadcast can also be found at NASRadicalSports.com. Send us your feedback, what your thoughts were about this most recent show, and any ideas for future shows and updates at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter, Facebook.com/NotAnotherSportsShow, NASRadicalSports@gmail.com, or our NASRadicalSports.com contact page. We were out pretty much the entire month of February again with some health issues. That one week we had a fever, and then the second week we ended up having some issues where the voice wasn't coming in, and then a massive cough every few moments. And so week after week after week, it was just something new after something new after something new, preventing us from coming in and talking about a number of serious sports and politics issues with you here on the broadcast. And so we are very excited to be back. We are very intrigued at the world of politics, the world of sports. And with Women's History Month in the month of March and International Women's Day coming up for next week's broadcast, we hope to be able to bring you a very exciting show for that, and also to start talking about some of these issues with a number of female sports writers, female athletes, and we will be trying to work on getting more of that representation here, especially for Women's History Month, and start talking about some of those very real and important representative topics, because I can sit here as the white cishet male aged 18 to death and start talking about all sorts of issues and simply know that everybody's going to listen to me and what I have to say. But it's also a powerful place to use that platform and use this space to highlight the work being done by a number of others, and use that space to amplify and signal boost the work that's being done by a number of others. So this has been Not Another Sports Show, NASRadicalSports.com, a radical look at the world of sports, and we will be back with you next week to talk about the world of sports, politics, and social activism.